This talk centres on the Battle of Hamel, 4th of July 1918. It was a relatively small battle, but one which established General John Monash's reputation, well, set at least among Australian historians, as an innovator, a meticulous planner, the man who set the precedent for the style of battle that would see the Allies through victoriously past the 100 Days offensives and win the war, of course. And the Battle of Hamel is seen as some as the perfect battle. I suppose the first question to answer, I don't know whether it applies to how many of you, but is where is Hamel? Well, we have a map there of the Somme region. That is the River Somme. That is the Ancre. Albert is there. And Hamel is down there just south of the River Somme. And that area is the area in which the battle took place. Now, close by is the Villers Bretonneux Memorial and Cemetery. And just behind it is the Sir John Monash Centre, a very good little interactive museum, actually, where you can learn how Australia won the war. And inside it is, modest, there he is, Monash, on his pedestal. They've put him on a pedestal, not surprisingly. Now, I don't want to knock him off his pedestal completely this afternoon. I just want to shake it a little bit. Anyway, Monash had been promoted to command Australian Corps on the 1st of June 1918. There he is in his glory. One of his first major concerns was a manpower crisis facing the Australian formations. The 5 divisions were actually short of 8,255 men, and replacements available amounted only to about 350 in France and a few thousand back in England. So Monash had a bit of a dilemma. He saw the need, as he himself put it, and I quote, the need for a demonstration that there was some kick left in the British Army. And he was keen that any such kick should be administered first, at any rate, by the Australians. But he couldn't afford to lose too many men doing it. He feared that the number of Australians' divisions, there were 5, would actually have to be reduced if they suffered too many casualties. And this was to seriously influence his thinking, as we shall see. Now, it's not quite clear whether the idea for an attack on Hamel was first proposed by Monash or by 4th Army Commander General Rawlinson. Not that it really matters now. In the end, Rawlinson asked Monash on the 18th of June to produce a plan and offered him 2 battalions of tanks to help out. This was to be the debut battle for the new Mark V tank, a vast improvement on previous versions. It was faster. It could do just over 4.5 miles an hour. It was more reliable mechanically, more manoeuvrable. It only required 1 man to steer it. And he reckoned that substantial numbers of these tanks used in an attack might drastically reduce the number of casualties suffered by the understrength infantry battalions. I suppose we should recall here that after Bullecourt in 1917, when the tanks failed to turn up, the Australians didn't exactly trust them. But they came round. Now, at Monash's HQ on the 19th of June, he briefed Brigadier General Anthony Courage, yes, of the Brewing family. He was in command of 5th Tank Brigade, and he informed him that it was to be strictly limited objective operation, no attempt at exploitation. So Courage then drew up a plan, and not surprisingly, seeing he's a tank man, this was to be primarily a tank operation. In a nutshell, the tanks would advance, capture the ground, while the infantry followed behind, would mop up and consolidate. No creeping artillery barrage, only a protective chute covering the consolidation of the final line. The artillery would, during the advance, aside from counter-battery work, would fire on enemy centres of resistance ahead of the tanks. So if we look at some of the detail on that, Courage suggested a total of 45 tanks. An advanced section, forming the first wave, would consist of 15 tanks. These would race ahead and outflank enemy positions. The main body, about 21 tanks, would follow about 50 yards behind, leading the infantry on to the objectives. There was the third wave of 9 tanks. They'd help mop up and replace any losses in the first 2 waves. Now, if you work it out, with an attack frontage of about 5,500 yards, that means 1 tank for every 370 yards in the first wave. It's not a lot, is it? And 1 every 260 yards in the second. Now, 0 hour, Courage assumed, would be around dawn, so that his tank crews would be able to see where they were going, which I suppose is not an unreasonable demand. Monash estimated that this plan would require about 7,500 infantry, 1 division plus a brigade. Half of this force would advance with the main body of tanks, and the rest would take over and consolidate the positions won. All sorted then. He also estimated that the attack couldn't go ahead any earlier than the first week in July, as they needed a period of training for joint infantry tank action. Brigadier General Blamey, Chief of Staff of Australian Corps, wrote to formation and unit commanders on the 21st of June, enclosing copies of the proposed plan for their consideration. A conference to discuss the plans took place 4 days later on the 25th. Present were Monash, Blamey, Courage, Sir Archibald Murray, that's Rawlinson's Chief of Staff, Major General McLagan, there he is, Officer Commanding 4th Division, Burgess, his artillery commander, and Brigadier Generals Peyton from 6th Brigade, Cannon from 11th, and Coxon from the Royal Field Artillery. Now, Monash and Courage proposed the plan to their commanders. Now, all the rest, in particular McLagan and Coxon, and even actually Monash's Chief of Staff, Blamey, there he is on the right, they were absolutely horrified. They simply refused to implement this experimental plan. They just would not do it. Blamey was asked, presumably to make it look as if there'd been a reasoned discussion, to produce a document listing the pros and cons of this plan. I'm not going to go into the details, but it boils down to 2 or 3 salient points. You would have infantry advancing onto machine gun posts without covering artillery fire. That could prove disastrous. Tanks advancing without infantry support, of course, are very vulnerable to enemy anti-tank fire. They reckoned mutual support was the answer, with the added security blanket, they said, of a normal, creeping artillery barrage. The men were familiar with it, and they trusted it. Coxon, the artillery commander, he put forward perhaps the most telling argument at the conference, and I quote here what he said. "It's purely a limited attack that you're making. We know we can make an absolute certainty of it by relying on artillery, so why not make it a certainty?" Faced by such opposition, Monash was forced to reconsider, and he swiftly backed down. By 26th of June, he'd come up with Plan B and wrote to Rawlinson explaining his change of heart. The new plan involved a standard creeping artillery barrage. We've all seen maps like that. That's what it looked like at Hamel. Perfectly conventional, advancing across the area to be captured. It involved over 600 guns, sweeping the entire terrain targeted. 11 battalions of infantry from 4 brigades going forward in conjunction with, not 50 yards behind, in conjunction with 54 tanks. North of the Somme, 15th Brigade would launch a couple of simultaneous diversionary attacks. Anyway, let's take a look at the battlefield. That's a quick view of it. You can see there's the village of Hamel, there's Ver Wood. The red line is the German front line. And of course the advance would be in that direction. The blue dotted line is the objective. Don't worry if that looks complicated. I'm not going to leave that up there long. That's just a little bit of an overview. The final deployments. 4 battalions of 11th Brigade. They would capture the village of Hamel itself, and they would go on to capture the heights of the Wolfsberg redoubt to the east of it. On their right, 4 battalions of 4th Brigade, they would take Ver and Hamel Woods, which is the obviously the green patch just to the east of them, before moving on to the blue line. About 1,000 yards they were having to advance, but they stopped short of across wood. Monash specifically said, we are not going to chase across into there, and we're not going to chase the gun lines. We're going to stop on that target line. And then finally, down the bottom, 2 battalions of 6th Brigade and 1 from 7th. They would make very limited advances on the southern extreme of the attack frontage, effectively forming a defensive flank across what is the, I'm sure you've driven along it, some of you, that very, very straight road that goes from Villers-Bretonneux onto Wharf-Fusée and then even further east. 0 hour was set at 3:10. Not quite light enough for our tank commander's liking, as it turned out. The artillery barrage, let's look at it again, would creep forward at a rate of 100 yards every 3 minutes as far as the halt line. They had a pause. That line there, it would reach that about 0 plus 30, and it would stay there for 10 minutes, giving the infantry time to reorganise before moving on then at about 100 yards every 4, until it reached a protective barrage line, 400 yards, there it is, beyond the objective. It would stay there until about 2 hours after 0, and then all firing would cease. If all went to plan, the Australians would be on their objectives in about 90 minutes. So the plan that was finally implemented wasn't Monash's original one, and even that was mostly Brigadier General Courage's anyway, but one forced upon him by his subordinate commanders. Now that's not to say that Monash wasn't meticulous in his planning. The final conference they had on the 30th of June, they did most of the disseminating of information by conference rather than by sending pages and pages and pages of written orders down. Final conference on the 30th of June, he arrived with a 130-point agenda. And if you type it out, and I've seen it typed out, it's 7 pages. The conference lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. And once everything had been agreed, that was it. There were to be absolutely no alterations thereafter. Well, that's what he said. We have to take a slight detour here in the story. 2 American divisions had moved up into the area behind British 3rd and 4th Armies at Haig's request to serve as a reserve force in case of a major German offensive, which they were still expecting. Sometime during June, it's not quite clear actually exactly, General Rawlinson came up with the idea of involving some of the American troops in this Hamel offensive. He had lunch with General Reed, who was commanding 2nd American Corps, there he is, on the 29th of June, and arranged with him to, and I quote from Rawlinson's diary, to employ 6 American companies with the Australians in their attack. Reed then authorised Major General Bell, commanding 33rd Division. I love that photograph, he's straight from the Civil War, isn't he? He arranged with Major General Bell to send a further 4 companies, making a total of 10 from the 131st and 132nd Regiments. So this equates to about 1 for each Australian frontline battalion on the 4th of July. And seeing as American companies numbered about 250 men, this addition to their numbers was welcomed by the Australian troops. They welcomed them with open arms. Joint training commenced at once, including units being rotated through the 5th Tank Brigade's training ground near Vaux, each battalion being given the opportunity to work with the tanks and the crews with whom they would operate. And there's a picture actually of the Americans training with one of those tanks. It was soon obvious that the Australians were starting to warm to the tanks and to their new American colleagues. A system of mutual communication was established between the infantry and the tanks. Flags hoisted on the tanks would tell the infantry what the tank was doing, calling the infantry on, coming out of action, or sorry, we've broken down, depending on which colour flag they hoisted. If the infantry were held up, they were to lie down and call upon a tank for assistance, either by signalling by waving a helmet on top of a rifle, or by firing a phosphorus grenade in the direction of the enemy position. Or, and I like this one, or going up to the tank, ringing the bell that had been rigged by the back door, and talking, or more likely shouting, to a tank crew member. I quite find, ding ding, hello, would you mind, just over there. Anyway, all was going well. Unfortunately, Generals Reed and Bell had somehow neglected to inform this fella, General Pershing. They hadn't told him that they were sending American units to take part in the forthcoming attack. And when he found out on the 2nd of July, he was not best pleased. He previously made it very, very clear that he was not going to allow American troops to fight under British or French command, but he would deploy them as purely American formations once he declared they were ready. He told his subordinates in no uncertain terms that the American companies must be withdrawn immediately. General Reed met with Rawlinson that evening and gave him the news. Rawlinson told Reed that he could withdraw 6 of the American companies, those with the rear battalions, but not the 4 that had already gone up to the front line. Australian units received orders to this effect on the 3rd of July, day before the attack. And the orders were actually carried out, much to the disappointment of both Americans and Australians alike. It soon became clear, however, that Pershing wanted all of his troops withdrawn. So Monash called an emergency meeting at 4th Division's HQ with Rawlinson and his Chief of Staff Montgomery present. Monash refused to send back the remaining 4 companies, telling Rawlinson that it was too late to change things. And if the Americans didn't take part, he'd cancel the whole thing. He would go ahead with the assault with the Americans unless Rawlinson gave him a direct order to the contrary by 6:30 p.m. Now, Rawlinson feared that inaction on his part might cost him his job. He reportedly said to Monash, "Do you want me to run the risk of being sent back to England? Do you mean it is worth that?" "Yes, I do," said Monash, clearly prepared to throw Rawlinson under the bus. He said, "It's more important to keep the confidence of the Americans and the Australians in each other than to preserve even an army commander." So Rawlinson did what he had to do. He passed the buck. He said, well, if Haig doesn't cancel before the deadline, all could proceed as planned. Now, Rawlinson knew full well that Haig was in his motor car on his way back from a conference in Paris and therefore could not be contacted. And he was unlikely to arrive back at GHQ before the deadline. So they got away with it. By the time Haig did get back, it was too late. And in fact, eventually Haig gave the go-ahead anyway. So we can add one more adjective to our list describing Monash. Devious. Interesting is actually Rawlinson's diary entry for that evening. He wrote, "If Pershing goes on like this, we will never win the war." So in the end, 4 companies of American troops took part in the assault. Let's move on to the actual attack then. In the days leading up to the assault, the Australian artillery, that's 5th Division's artillery, they've been regularly bombarding the German positions in the early morning, around 3 a.m, sending over smoke and gas shells, amongst the regular HE and shrapnel. So, when the artillery opened up at 2 minutes past 3 on the 4th of July, the expectation was that the Germans would not be overly concerned to begin with, and they included smoke in the barrage, but no gas. The Australians would not therefore have to wear gas masks, but hoped that the Germans, used to the routine, would put theirs on. The ruse worked. Many German soldiers were found wearing their gas masks during the attack. At the same time as the artillery barrage kicked off, aeroplanes, the loudest they could find, were cruising to and fro overhead, drowning out the sound of the approach of the tanks, which started about 1,000 yards behind. But they set off early and they were meant to come up to the infantry at about 0. At 3:10, the intensity of the artillery fire suddenly increased as the barrage proper fell on the German front line positions. All along the line, the Australian infantry moved forward. So let's have a look at what happened. We'll take it one brigade at a time. Beginning on the right, the southern flank of the attack. Again, don't worry too much about the detail on that. I will give you a different view in a moment. Front line of the 6th and 7th Brigades. It sat atop the Villers-Bretonneux Plateau, which from the air looks like that. Looks very flat. It's not actually that flat. And astride, as I said, that monotonously straight road that still runs west to east along the ridge. It faced more or less southeast and stretched down the slope to the left there towards Vere Wood. No man's land varied from about 500 to less than 100 yards. 3 battalions were in the front line. 25th, there they are, 23rd and 21st. 21st had to advance about 1,000 yards to reach its objective. They've got a fair way to go. Nowhere in the advance would actually take them beyond the artillery halt line. So if you remember, that they reached the halt line in 30 minutes. So they had 30 minutes to do what they had to do. The men of B and D Company's 25th Battalion filed out through the gaps in their wire, opened into extended order, and set off, following the barrage as closely as they dared. They did come up against a strong machine gun post next to the main road. There it is in yellow. And were also caught in the German counter barrage. Casualties mounted very quickly and the position became critical, particularly in B Company, whose leading 2 platoons were down to a total of 9 men. With 2nd Lieutenant Toft already dead, Sergeant Ham and Corporal Richardson took charge. Richardson turned his Lewis gun on the machine gun post, and Sergeant Ham and the rest, all 7 of them, stormed the position. D Company, with a shorter distance to go, was able to report at 3:35 that their section of the German front line had been captured, having not met with any stiff resistance until they reached the enemy trench. They were led by this fella, Lieutenant Ochterlony, and it was at this point, it says in the diary, the Australians put their bayonets to good use. Ochterlony himself, he was recommended for the MC, but sadly he was killed in action on the 10th of August, aged 22. And he'd also had 2 brothers killed in Gallipoli in 1915. 7th Brigade diary states, the advance was so rapid that our troops reached the objective before the enemy infantry were aware that an attack was in progress. Consolidation began, but the Germans weren't quite finished yet, of course not. Around 4:20 a.m, a German counter-attack to regain the strong post was launched along the main road, the yellow arrow there. The 9 men defending it put up an SOS signal, and the reply from the artillery and the trench mortars kept most of the Germans at bay. Some got close, however, but they sent some reinforcements down from D Company to help establish a trench block, and the German initiative actually dwindled away. Eventually they put 2 Vickers machine guns there, placed them either side of the road, Lewis guns posted as well. That was enough of a deterrent to keep the Germans away permanently. They'd suffered 2 officers and 19 other ranks killed, 1 officer and 71 other ranks wounded. A not insignificant casualty rate of 37%. And if you notice, I haven't mentioned any tanks yet. That's because they didn't have any down there. Now, the 23rd Battalion, accompanied by 3 tanks, caught some of the German garrison by surprise. Captain Short of A Company reported they wore no equipment and carried no rifles or gas helmets. They must have been sleeping or chatting when our barrage fell on them. Well, it wasn't all that easy. Short does go on to say that the machine gunners, the German machine gunners, put up more of a fight. One unfortunate incident is worthy of mention. Gentleman there, 2nd Lieutenant Breen of C Company, leading his men down an enemy trench, threw a grenade into a dugout, but a German soldier picked it up and threw it back, killing the unfortunate Australian. Breen was a former sergeant in A Company. He had won the military medal in Belgium the previous year, and just returned to the battalion from officer training, having been commissioned on the 1st of June. It's interesting if you look at the Australian Red Cross wounded and missing files, where people are asked to give reports of how people were killed. For Breen, there were 18 accounts, and they're all different. We have people saying the grenade wasn't thrown back by a German, it rebounded from a curtain. It wasn't a dugout at all, it was a shallow scrape and bounced back from there. It hit the frame of the dugout. We've got all kinds of things going on. I just picked one out of the 18 to say that's what happened. I don't know which is the true one. Anyway, the Australians began to consolidate their newly won positions. Some survivors of the German garrison tried to retreat through the tall crop growing behind their line, and Lewis guns basically accounted for quite a few, although a good many managed to escape. 2 of the tanks, one had already ditched, having helped to neutralise a number of machine gun posts, continued forward to deal with any German posts they could find. One particularly troublesome machine gun, about 50 yards ahead of D Company, was eventually captured by Lieutenant Berry's tank. Berry led his tank on foot and killed some of the German crew with his revolver. And for all that, he received absolutely no gallantry award. Casualties in 23 Battalion were low, total of 75. On the left, brigade frontage, 21st Battalion had, at least on paper, the most difficult task, 1,000 yards to advance, crossing 2 German trench lines before establishing themselves in a third, with one company forming a south-facing defensive flank. They attacked in 2 waves, both of them making for the final objective. As with their neighbours, 3 tanks would go with them. Confidence, it seems, was high. Order number 155, issued on 3rd of July, contained the following. A complete German rifle and equipment is required for the War Museum. All ranks are reminded that souvenirs, either our own or the enemy's, will be gladly received at this depot. So never mind about fighting, just get us a rifle, will you? We need it for the museum. Anyway, they went forward on time, soon across the first trench line, encountering very little opposition and almost no wire, actually. German garrison once more taken largely by surprise, the final objective was reached in good time. Once it became clear that the Australians had no intention of advancing any further, a sniping duel developed. And Private Jack Arthur, seeing his mate, Private Johansson, killed by a German sniper, continued firing and later claimed 4 hits. He was recommended for the military medal. No counter-attack developed at this point, and the tanks patrolled ahead of the new line. One of them, clearly exceeding his brief, was seen heading in the direction of Warfusay village, about 1,000 yards further on. It's not even on the picture. Engaging enemy posts as he felt like it. 21st Battalion diary says, apparently he enjoyed himself thoroughly out there and ultimately returned safely. Their advance had been quite rapid, and with the telephone line having been successfully run out to the final objective, first reports of their success reached battalion headquarters just before 4 o'clock in the morning. Casualties again low. 9 other ranks killed, 2 officers and 43 wounded, with 8 missing. Total casualties with this right-wing sector are as follows. Not remarkably high, but neither are they remarkably low, I wouldn't say. Fatalities for this sector, according to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, comes to 3 officers and 57 other ranks. Charles Bean, in the Australian official history, goes perhaps a little too far when he describes the advance of 6th and 7th Brigades thus. Here, progress assumed the ease of a field day. Well, it was over quickly. Whole objective reached before the barrage halted for its 10-minute pause. And those are the final positions that they took up. That's the 21st having gone furthest to form their little defensive flank there. Let's move up to the centre sector of the attack. Again, unless you've got about half an hour to look at that, it's going to be quite complicated. So again, don't worry about it. That just gives you some idea. This was 4th Brigade, Brigadier General Charles Brand. 3 battalions in the front line. Now they could see their final objective from their trenches. They were quite high up on one ridge, and the blue line was actually on the next ridge, between 2,000 and 3,000 yards away. Directly in the way, let's have a look at it, was their wood. That's the dark green in the centre. And the German front line, you can just about see the red. You've got a couple of redoubts, Kidney Trench and Pear Trench, and the village of Hamel is up here. They were attacking in this general direction. It was assumed that fighting through the wood would be a rather slow and arduous process. So the plan required the wood to be enveloped in a double pincer movement to the north and south, meaning that the central battalion was to advance as far as its eastern edge and no further. On the right, there they are, 13th Battalion. They would squeeze through the narrow gap between the brigade boundary and the southern edge of the wood and redeploy during the artillery pause, fanning out to occupy the final objective as far north as Hun's Walk, which was a German communication trench running back through the wood. There it is. 16th Battalion in the centre would capture, and they would clear the wood, and then they'd withdraw back to their original front line. 15th Battalion on the left, they'd moved down into the valley to the north of the wood, having eliminated Pear Trench. That was most important. And then up the gentle slope to the objective. 14th Battalion, I haven't bothered putting them on there. They're way back in reserve. Brigade strength, 4th of July, was 178 officers and 3,490 ranks. But only the 13th and the 15th battalions had American troops attached. Now, they also had 15 tanks in this sector. 3 would go around the southern edge of the wood with 13th Battalion, and 3 would do the same to the north with 15th, and 6 would help to clear the German trench in front of Fairwood before moving through it, along tracks that I'd identified by aerial reconnaissance. I've got one of the original aerial reconnaissance photographs. It isn't that clear, but one of the tracks is there, one of them is there, and if you look closely enough, I guarantee it is there. There is another one up through there as well. Now, Pear Trench was singled out for special attention. Not surprisingly, it was a well-defended redoubt, basically. 3 tanks of A Company, under Captain Heath, would, I quote, subdue the strong point before carrying on to the blue line. Okay, 16th Battalion in the centre. Let's take them first. They had a battalion frontage of about 800 yards, 2 waves, all 4 companies in the front line. As the artillery barrage opened up, it soon became clear that some of the guns were firing short. One of these shorts blew Captain Linus, there he is, of D Company, off his feet when he was lying there on the jumping off tape. He was bleeding profusely from 2 wounds, but he refused to go back or even have his wounds treated. On the right, A Company, led by Major Harwood, seemed to have completed their task with very little trouble. 2 men, a Sergeant Butler and a Private Johnston, earned military medals, rushing and capturing German machine gun posts in the wood, and the company came through the battle with only 14 men wounded and 1 fatality, the unfortunate Corporal Scott. On their left, Captain Wood's company, they were to lose 11 men killed during their attack, by far the highest company casualty rate in the battalion. They came up against strong opposition from the German frontline trench. Platoons met with mixed success, depending on whether they found gaps in the enemy wire or came up against intact sections. To the left, after Lieutenant Minchin won a bar to his MC for taking out 1 machine gun post, a Lewis gun section was struggling against some uncut wire, giving the Germans time to set up a machine gun in Kidney Trench, if you remember that was on one of the pictures previously. And it started to inflict casualties on this unfortunate section. A shell also landed in their midst, killing the company commander, Captain Woods, and 5 other men. including Company Sergeant Major Blinman. Now, all these three had actually been Company Sergeant Majors together in the 16th Battalion, and they're all buried together in Daour Communal Cemetery Extension. This incident was witnessed by Lance Corporal Thomas Axford. He dashed across to the machine gun post, threw grenades in amongst the crew, jumped into the trench, bayoneted 10 of the enemy, and captured a further 6 before throwing the machine guns over the parapet and calling his comrades on. Axford, not surprisingly, was awarded the Victoria Cross. And with the aforementioned Lieutenant Minchin now in command, C Company were able to surge forward onto their objective. B Company's advance went very much to plan. They moved through the wood, secured Huns Walk communication trench, suffering only 2 casualties. The wounded Captain Linus, there he is again, led his men forward, lagging slightly behind the barrage as they slogged uphill through the wood. Linus was wounded again, but once more refused treatment. They encountered a German company HQ, stubbornly defended. Linus signalled to a tank for assistance, but before it could get there, somebody lobbed a phosphorus grenade into the dugout. That sorted it. The survivors surrendered immediately. The company just lost 1 man killed that day and captured a total of 150 prisoners and 8 machine guns. And Linus was awarded the DSO for his outstanding leadership that day. He actually received the decoration during a battalion inter-company cricket match on the 30th of July. Just after 5 a.m, with the woods secured and cleared, 16th Battalion were ordered to return to their original frontline positions. The tanks had proved themselves very useful. Many Germans had surrendered at the very sight of a tank, but the machine gun crews, and I quote from 8th Tank Battalion Diary, showed extraordinary courage and tenacity and refused to surrender, being completely wiped out or run over by a tank. There are innumerable cases of tanks running over and crushing machine gun emplacements and crews. 16th Battalion lost 18 men, 59 wounded. Many of these actually, and unfortunately, caused by short firing of their own artillery. On the right brigade front, we're back to 13th Battalion, with about 200 men attached from the 132nd Regiment US Army, were briefed on their complicated manoeuvre by their CO, Lieutenant Colonel Marks, 2 days before the assault. Every man in the battalion had a map, and every officer and NCO carried an air reconnaissance photo. The 3 tanks caught up with the infantry just as the artillery performed its first lift, perfectly timed, and German posts were taken by surprise and overrun with little difficulty. Unfortunately, on the right, C Company, here we go again, suffered from short firing 18-pounders, along with an American section that was advancing too quickly and got mixed up with the barrage. Corporal Roach, 9th Platoon, saw what was happening, rushed forward to bring the Americans back. He succeeded, but was badly wounded and died the following day in the casualty clearing station. Tank 9044, a mail tank, advancing near the brigade boundary, also received a direct hit from one of the 18-pounders, one of their own 18-pounders. A HE shell, which put it out of action, wounded 5 of the crew. And sadly, the 13th Battalion scout, Private Thomas Parrish, riding with the tank and helping to direct it from the conning tower, was killed. Deprived of their supporting tank, C Company pressed forward, swinging their left wing forward as they reached the blue line. A Company then shifted direction behind the wood. They came under serious machine gun fire from a post in a trench that was so well camouflaged that it didn't actually appear on the maps or the aerial photos. Captain Marper, commanding, who'd already captured 1 machine gun nest, rushed across, attracted the attention of a tank, but was wounded in the arm and chest. He remained to see the tank lumber over the machine gun nest, crushing the crews. Now Marper, I apologise for the quality of the photograph, it's the only one I could find of him. He survived, returned to his native Sheffield, and married his childhood sweetheart Emily that September. He had the bullet removed from his chest and kept it as a souvenir. He lived to the age of 82, dying in 1973. The battalion was then able to move forward onto the objective, with B Company moving up to fill a gap in the line. Casualties for the day, 126, 26 of them fatal. American casualties, from a total of 227, were 57, 7 fatal, and 4 of their 5 officers were wounded. We move to the left. 15th Battalion, longest advance, way past the southern outskirts of Hamel. And of course, they got Pear Trench to deal with. I haven't even put anything near that yet. There'd been an unsuccessful raid on Pear Trench on the night of the 15th, 16th of June, so they knew what it was like in there. They knew it was going to be hard. Captain Carter, A Company, was given the job of taking that particular situation. And of course, the 3 tanks that were promised. Here we go, A Company attacking Pear Trench. Unfortunately, and this, I don't know who to blame for this one, some artillery commander, the artillery barrage fell to begin with just in front of the redoubt, and its first lift took it beyond it. And the heavy artillery began beyond it as well. So in fact, Pear Trench was not bombarded. So the wire, the machine gun posts and the garrison hadn't been touched. Not only this, but some of the shells were also falling 200 yards short. And this continued all the way through the advance, right up to the final objective. The battalion had 12 killed and 30 wounded, even before they moved forward from the jumping off take. Now, A Company rushed forward towards Pear Trench, as they should, coming up against uncut wire, heavy machine gun fire and a shower of grenades. They did as they'd been instructed. They went to ground and they waited for the tanks. Trouble was, in the dark, and with Pear Trench actually on a reverse slope, Captain Heath's tanks had completely lost direction and they missed the redoubt completely. They never turned up. So, the company's Lewis gunners managed to suppress a couple of German machine guns, but when it became clear that the tanks weren't coming, the men had no choice but, and I quote their diary, dash in with the bayonet. It turned into a nasty hand-to-hand scrap. Now, Private Henry, now I don't know whether you pronounce that DL as in the proper Scottish way, or if the Australians call him Dalziel, I don't know. But anyway, he was number 2 in a Lewis gun section, and he'd helped to suppress the first 2 machine guns, but a third opened up to the left. He fitted a fresh magazine to his mate's gun, drew his revolver, rushed the German position, killing the crew, capturing the gun, losing his trigger finger to a bullet wound as he did so. Later in the day, he received a head wound whilst recovering ammunition boxes. In the picture, he's still got the bandage on his head from that, and he too received the Victoria Cross. There were 2 VCs awarded that day. Australian pressure and I suppose sheer bloody-mindedness pushed the Germans back out of the redoubt. As they reached the rear trench of the redoubt, some of the enemy surrendered, raising their hands. Others behind, however, continued to throw grenades. In response to what the War Diary labelled as rank treachery, the Queenslanders did, well, you can probably guess what they did. Yeah. This unsupported attack on the redoubt cost the battalion most of its 240 casualties. 2 vital components of Monash's plan to minimise casualties had failed. The artillery barrage had missed the redoubt, and so had the tanks. Luckily, the rest of the advance didn't prove equally difficult as they went on. They did continue to suffer under their own shrapnel the whole way to the Blue Line. The tanks caught up eventually at the 10-minute artillery pause, too late of course, and they were able to suppress a few machine guns along the road as they went on. And B Company did encounter some machine gun fire from the southern part of Pear Trench because A Company was still in the process of capturing it when they went by. Company commander, Captain Porter, was wounded, and he eventually died of his wounds in London on the 25th of November 1918. He's buried in Brookwood Cemetery. Anyway, C Company did reach the objective line right on time at 0 plus 90 minutes. It's interesting to note that with the tanks pushing ahead out as far as Acrosh Wood, If you remember, that was the second wood that Monash didn't want to take. The German history of the 55th Infantry Regiment claims that although the Australians broke through, the arrival of their 3rd Battalion in the line successfully halted any further advances, further attempts to push forward being repulsed. The author was clearly ignorant of the fact that the Australians had no designs on Acrosh wood anyway, and they were going to stop. Those are their final positions. The pincer movement complete by 8 a.m. A complete line had been formed. A supply tank came forward with material, and they got some wire in place, as I say, by about 8 o'clock. No counter-attack, but there was still, even at this point, artillery shorts were causing problems and causing casualties. Total casualties for 15th Battalion, quite high. 3 officers, 41 other ranks killed. 8 officers and 190 wounded. And the American contingent suffered over 50 casualties. A very uncomfortable portion of these casualties must have been caused by the shorts from their own artillery, although the unsupported attack on Pear Trench probably accounted for the majority. 14th Battalion, they were carrying supplies, establishing forward dumps, etc. They don't really come into the action much at all. They did eventually lose, they managed to lose 7 men somehow, but their casualties were very light. Brigade casualties for the day come out at 580. Those are the actual fatalities according to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Let's move to the final section, the northern sector of the battlefield. Again, it looks rather complicated, that one, but we'll sort it out. 43rd Brigade. In the centre there, their job was to capture and mop up Hamel village itself. 44th Battalion behind, 42nd Battalion on the left. 42nd Battalion, they advanced across what was rather open ground to the north of the village. You can stand there in the village and look out. It's absolutely flat as a snooker table, no cover, nothing there. To the north of the village and make straight for the blue line. That was a relatively simple job, supposedly. 43rd Battalion, they would capture and mop up Hamel. B Company would head straight in. A and C companies would advance on each flank and then would turn inwards and start the clearing of the dugouts, the cellars, the strong points, etc. Once this was done, 43rd's job was finished and they could withdraw from the village so as not to worry about any German artillery retaliation. 44th Battalion, they would bypass the village north and south before converging on the Wolfsberg strong point on the heights behind it. Almost half of all the tanks deployed for this battle supported this brigade sector. 3 tanks would advance with 42nd to the blue line, 6 would help capture the village, and 6 more would aim for the Wolfsberg. 44 Vickers machine guns were there to bolster the artillery barrage. Pershing's 3rd of July purge meant that only 42nd and 43rd battalions had American troops with them. And this actually reduced the brigade numbers immediately from 3,000 to 2,000. Anyway, let's look at 42nd Brigade first, the one with the supposedly simple enough task. Their ultimate objective was the old British front line that had been evacuated in April 1918. A and C companies in front, B and D in support. The accounts of the attack are very short on detail. It simply says they proceeded towards their objective, which was taken with very little difficulty and few casualties. All companies were consolidated by 8 a.m. Hun, completely surprised, gave little resistance. The barrage in this particular sector was absolutely perfect, for once. The tanks caught up as the artillery made its second lift and went ahead, making short work of the German machine gun positions. They reached the blue line by 4:15. Just 1 officer killed. Hit in the throat. Well, I said the artillery barrage was perfect. Not quite. 1 artillery shell, an Australian artillery shell, got him in the throat and killed him. 43rd Battalion. They moved out onto the jumping off tapes at about 2:30. But it was decided to move C Company back, there they are, about 50 yards because of artillery shells falling short near Pear Trench. Trouble was, 2 guns on that particular flank were firing short all the way through the operation. 2 sections of C Company, 1 Australian and 1 American, suffered casualties before they'd moved. That 50-yard safety buffer had actually put them in danger. I've just put the arrows on top of a contemporary photograph. Hamel village is there. And that's the movement of the companies. A Company on the left were luckier. The barrage led them into No Town Mel Wood to the north, and they approached the German trench line. 2 tanks overtook them, and they took out the machine gun posts as the infantry advanced. B Company in the centre moved straight into the village, lost 2 men killed by an artillery shot, again as they did so. Private Joseph Gallagher, number 1 of a Lewis gun team, won a DCM, attacking a strong point containing 2 German machine guns. The rest of his team had become casualties, so he rushed the position, firing his Lewis gun from the hip, using up 3 magazines as he went. And then with 2 men from another section, captured 2 more guns and 7 prisoners. Once across the German trench line into the village, each platoon had been designated a specific area to mop up, and this was done within about half an hour. And it was helped by tanks which cruised the streets. If you look very carefully, there is the tank cruising the street. And if you stand in the same position, note the pillars for the fencing there. That's the modern view. The pillars are still there. That's the same road. The tank would have been about where that car is. On the right, C Company, understandably slow to move off under this short shooting, also came under fire from Pear Trench, particularly number 9 platoon. Their officer, Lieutenant Brooke, was killed. Corporal Shaw, a Lewis gunner, and Corporal Zybert, an American, made straight for the offending machine gun, Zybert bayoneting 3 of the crew. The American was actually awarded a military medal, and Shaw, involved in taking a second machine gun position later, got the DCM. As they approached the outskirts of the village, unfortunately, a tank, probably from C Company, 8th Tank Battalion, mistakenly opened fire on the Australians. It really wasn't C Company's day, was it? Nevertheless, they made it into the village and began clearing up. At 5 to 5, 3 green rockets were launched into the air to announce that the town was ours. Captain Moran of A Company climbed to the roof of one of the few houses in Hamel still standing and hoisted aloft a French tricolour. There it is. It stayed there for about 3 days, apparently. 43rd Battalion was then allowed to withdraw and started digging a series of posts to the west of Hamel. This suffered a total of 99 casualties, including 2 officers and 24 other ranks killed. It was estimated that about 100 Germans had been killed and between 450 and 500 taken prisoner in that sector. 25 machine guns were also captured. And around 9 o'clock, aircraft of number 9 Squadron, Australian Air Force, began dropping ammunition by parachute. This was one of Monash's new ideas. First time it had been tried in action, and they successfully managed to drop about 112,000 rounds. But it was at the cost of 2 aircraft, unfortunately. And the fate of one, it's an amazing photograph, this, an RE-8 crewed by Lieutenants Reiki and Knowles, was caught on camera. Apparently the parachute wrapped itself around the wing and the pilot was unable to keep it in the air. It crashed east of Hamel, killing both of the crew. Now that leaves us just with 44th Battalion's assault on the Wolfsberg. Let's turn the aerial shot around and look in the other direction, from the German side of the wire. If anybody's been up on the Wolfsberg, that circle there, of course, is the Australian Memorial at Hamel. It's about 260 feet higher than the village. Now, 44th Battalion, with A and B companies on the left, C and D on the right, leapfrogged those 43rd Battalion troops and made straight for the heights. 8 tanks by this time, well in the lead. One had actually been knocked out, and we have a picture of it. There it is. And funnily enough, you can actually see the little flag as well on the building, which is still there. B Company had been slightly held up, oddly, by the sheer number of German prisoners making their way back through the wood to the north of Hamel. And D Company had to deal with a couple of machine gun posts, but the advance on the Wolfsberg began at 0+41. They moved up the slope as it was beginning to get light, meeting only limited opposition from isolated posts. It seems that by the time the infantry crested the slope, the tanks had already wreaked havoc. The 44th Battalion War Diary says, 8 tanks wobbled here and there over the slopes and summit of the ridge, clearing the Boche out of his strong defences. D Company had to actually rush one active machine gun post, and it turned out to be a battalion HQ. They captured 100 prisoners, including a colonel and 5 other officers. And interestingly, one more weapon was captured, a German anti-tank rifle, a Mauser Tankgewehr M1918. 1.7 metres in length, 18.5 kilograms heavy, and it took a 13.2 millimetre bullet. That's the one at the top. I've just put it on the same picture as a Lee Enfield so you can see how big this damn thing is. I think they actually fired it from a sort of a bipod, or you rested it on something, because firing it from the shoulder was probably a no-no, unless you want to end it up about 50 yards behind where you were. First time apparently that one of those had been captured from the Germans. Anyway, the companies established themselves on the ridge. A Company there, you can see, on the left. B Company, more or less central. D Company on the right. C Company in support. The only immediate threat the Germans were able to mount was aerial at this point. About 11 a.m., 30 enemy planes appeared and dropped bombs and machine gunned the Australians as they were trying to consolidate the positions. RE8s from number 3 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps, managed to drive the enemy planes away by midday. And with the tanks having withdrawn by then, there was actually something of a lull in the battle. Wasn't all over though. A German strong point on the left front of B Company was proving to be something of a nuisance, and a raid to neutralise it was arranged to go in at 10:30 that night. At 9:45, however, the Germans launched a counter-attack from it, in that direction there. 1st Battalion of the 202nd Reserve Infantry Regiment had received orders at 10 that morning to move up and retake the Wolfsberg, but the Australian artillery barrage and continuous airstrikes had prevented them from advancing, and it cost them a number of casualties. It was evening by the time they were able to attack. 200 to 300 men recaptured about 200 yards of the Australian front line, straddling A and B Company sectors. Australian bombing parties were organised to eject the Germans from the trench. Captain Stables of A Company would assault the position from the north, coming down here. Lieutenants Gaze and Cornish would attack from the other direction. They went in at 2:45 a.m. Stables and his party on the northern flank actually met strong resistance and were held up. But the southern party, including Sergeant Ingverson, Corporal Pope of the American forces, and Private Lynch, forced the Germans back one bay at a time, forcing them down into dugouts and pushing the rest back down the shallow communication trench. German resistance crumbled and they fled over open ground, the Australians firing their Lewis guns at them from the hip. Unfortunately, just at this point, Private Lynch was killed. Lieutenant Cornish received the DSO, Lieutenant Gaze a bar to his MC. Ingverson was awarded the DCM. Corporal Pope, who had rushed and captured a machine gun single-handed, got a DCM from us and the American Medal of Honor from his own country. The fight for the Wolfsberg was effectively over. It had cost 44th Battalion 195 casualties, 30 of them fatal. That's what the final positions look like. There are the battalions on the blue line, and there's the Wolfsberg. Overall 11th Brigade casualties. There we go, I needn't bother reading them to you. German losses overall on the day, 31 officers and 1,170. Fatalities were about 660, it was estimated. Now it's probable that a large proportion of the Australian losses in 11th Brigade were sustained in the attack unsupported by tanks, as you remember, on Pear Trench and through short shooting of their own artillery. They've got to be classified, therefore, I would say, as avoidable. There were diversionary attacks. There's no time to go into those now, but very quickly, there was a Chinese attack here, a small raid there, and a bit of German trench was captured up by the River Ancre up there by 59th Battalion. It did cost a further 210 casualties, though. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure what the advantage was, whether there was any real point. Did it help the main attack? Possibly. Difficult to say. Anyway, let's sum up. We've got positives. It was all over in 93 minutes. All the objectives were gained. And help. Positive influence of the tanks, particularly at the Wolfsberg. Relatively modest casualties. The total is about 1,200 Australian and American casualties, 374 fatalities. Quite heavy German losses, 2,000 plus. The detailed briefings went a long way to ensuring that things went more or less as they wanted them to. The ammunition drops by parachute proved very successful and were repeated again during the 100 Days offensive. And surprise was gained along much of the front. If we believe John Terrain's judgment that Hamel was a textbook victory, this talk would end now. But there are negatives. Monash Encourage's first plan was greeted with dismay by his commanders, had to be reworked into a plan B that was neither revolutionary nor visionary, but an amalgamation of already understood principles. The last-minute withdrawal of American troops did not help at all. The non-arrival of tanks at Pear Trench and the fact that the artillery barrage also missed it cost the battalion earmarked to take it most of its 240 casualties. I mean, I asked the question, in that case, why not just bypass it, isolate it, come back to it later? I don't know. Artillery firing short. It's reported actually in every brigade diary. And as I said, the 257 casualties sustained in diversionary attacks of dubious value. So, Monash is still on his pedestal, but I don't think we should put him on a higher one. Thanks very much.